Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
I didn't find out from my mother or father, or even from a well-meaning cousin who slipped up. I found out from a group chat I wasn't even supposed to see, one of those messy digital family threads that exist half on purpose and half by accident, where siblings, in-laws, and parents dump photos of decorated trees, casserole recipes, and those tacky holiday jokes you forget 5 minutes later. I was scrolling one evening, after a long day at work when the office was winding down for the holidays, when I saw a forwarded screenshot in my cousin Emily's chat. The words burned into me before my brain even decided if it was worth rereading. This year we should keep Christmas small. Just parents and couples. Singles can celebrate separately. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of tasteless joke. My family had their fair share of cutting remarks, little digs at my expense whenever the conversation turned to marriage or kids, but outright excluding me from Christmas because I wasn't married? That felt unreal. I kept scrolling to see if maybe someone had pushed back, maybe one of my brothers had said, "Come on, that's ridiculous." But no. The chat was filled with nods, thumbs up emojis, and a final line from my mother herself, "You'll understand when you have your own family." I sat there in silence, not even angry at first, just hollow. I could hear the hum of my refrigerator, the faint noise of neighbors arguing through the thin walls of my apartment, and the weight of realization pressing down like snow piling on a roof. The message wasn't just words, it was a verdict. They didn't see me as part of them anymore, at least not in the way that mattered when it came to tradition. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep my fingers from firing off a storm of texts that would only get twisted against me later. I knew how this game went. If I protested, they'd call me too sensitive. If I sulked, they'd laugh about me being dramatic. So instead, I typed nothing. My silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. The next day, while coworkers compared plans for holiday trips to Florida or visits to in-laws, I smiled through my teeth and nodded, my mind elsewhere. Their words faded in and out, a dull drone against the sharper voice inside me that whispered, "They wanted you out of the picture." Fine. But you won't give them the satisfaction of seeing you wounded. That night, I poured myself a glass of cheap red wine and opened my laptop. My fingers hovered for a moment, then tapped out the words I hadn't dared to consider before: luxury ski resorts Christmas packages. The search results bloomed across the screen: Aspen lodges with floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Tahoe cabins with private hot tubs, resorts in Colorado that promised champagne at check-in, and slopes glowing with Christmas lights. My pulse quickened as I clicked through photos of strangers wrapped in fur-trimmed coats, couples laughing beside blazing fireplaces, families crowding into gondolas with snowflakes caught in their hair. I wasn't a couple, I wasn't bringing kids, but I was damn sure not going to spend Christmas staring at a bare apartment wall, listening to my family post their group photos with everyone smiling in matching pajamas while I pretended not to care. At first, guilt tried to creep in, whispering that this was petty, that I was proving them right by going off alone. But the more I scrolled, the more the guilt melted into something sharper, a kind of cold satisfaction. They had carved me out of their plans because I wasn't complete in their eyes. Fine. I'd show them that I didn't need their definition of complete to live better than they imagined. The packages weren't cheap. 1 week at a five-star ski resort was enough to make me hesitate, to think of bills stacked on my kitchen counter and the long winter months ahead. But then I pictured my mother's smug smile when she announced that Christmas was for families only, and I clicked book now. The confirmation email landed in my inbox seconds later, glowing on the screen like a weapon disguised as an invitation. I leaned back in my chair, a strange calm spreading through me. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't begged for inclusion, I hadn't even replied to their message. Instead, I had made a decision they would only learn about when the right moment came, when the photos hit Instagram and they realized the daughter they sidelined was living a version of Christmas they couldn't touch. I sat there in the dim light of my apartment, the sound of the city muffled by winter's grip outside, and I felt something close to triumph. They thought they had cut me out. They hadn't realized I was already sketching the outline of my revenge. I closed the laptop slowly, savoring the quiet finality of the motion, and whispered under my breath like a promise only I needed to hear, "Merry Christmas, Mom. Enjoy your small gathering." And with that, I left the room, the unopened wine bottle still on the counter, my suitcase in the closet suddenly calling to me as if it knew its time was coming sooner than expected. When I turned off the lights and lay down in bed, I didn't dream of family dinners or warm hugs or the comfort of tradition. I dreamed of mountains, of crisp white slopes, of the sting of cold air in my lungs and the heat of satisfaction in my chest as I carved my own holiday out of the silence they left behind. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a new message lighting up from the family chat, a photo of my brothers hanging Christmas lights outside my parents' house, everyone smiling like nothing was wrong. I let it fade into darkness without touching it, because I already knew my holiday had begun, and theirs would never look the same once mine was revealed. Morning arrived with the kind of brittle winter light that makes the city look staged and temporary, as if the storefronts and bus stops and salted sidewalks were props that someone could sweep away after the holidays. And I moved through my apartment with the focus of a person who has already made a decision and now only needs to build a runway for it, pulling the suitcase from the closet, laying out the thick socks and thermal leggings and the sweater I never wore because it felt too luxurious for every day, then opening my laptop to cross-check flights, transfer times, and the small humiliations that travel agencies hide in fine print until you are already halfway committed. I told myself I was only being practical, but the truth was I was choreographing a performance, because what they called exclusion I would recast as presence, and what they imagined as a quiet, chastened holiday for me I would turn into a loud, deliberate refusal to accept the role they were so eager to assign. I spent an hour comparing resorts that looked almost identical in the photos and yet revealed their differences if you looked slowly enough, noticing which ones promised a fireplace you could really sit beside without singeing your knees, which ones had a spa that sounded like an actual refuge rather than a tiled room with music that made your head ache, which ones offered a shuttle that ran late enough that a person traveling alone would not have to choose between convenience and safety, and by the time I chose the Colorado property with the long cedar bar and the lobby that smelled faintly of orange peel and pine, I could feel the steadiness of the choice settling in as if a winter coat had finally found my shoulders. I paid for an upgraded seat using miles I had earned on business trips where I stayed to help my brothers' families with airport pickups and luggage while my parents cooed over grandkids, and as I clicked confirm I felt a small, righteous satisfaction that the caretaking I had been told was invisible could still, if I decided it would, carry me somewhere my family could not follow. Packing became a ritual and a message at the same time, because I was not just folding clothes, but choosing what version of myself would be photographed, tagged, and interpreted by the people who had consigned me to the guest list that never reached my inbox. I rolled my wool coat carefully so it would unspool without creases, tucked a scarlet lipstick into the side pocket of the cosmetics bag despite barely wearing it, added the slim black turtleneck that always makes my posture straighten, then set my phone on the bed and adjusted the privacy settings so my posts would be visible to family, but my stories would remain friends only, a small lever of control in a system that usually turns people into content without asking. I drafted a caption in notes that I did not intend to use verbatim, a sentence about carving out new traditions when the old ones stop making room for you. And even as I wrote it, I heard my mother's voice reading it aloud in that careful tone she reserves for things she does not understand and therefore suspects as a performance. I deleted the sentence, because the most effective reply to contempt is not a counterargument, but the evidence of a life that does not require permission. The apartment looked different with the suitcase by the door, the boarding pass in my email, and the airport car service booked for pre-dawn on the day before Christmas Eve. A detail I chose precisely because it would allow me to post a sunrise from the window of a plane while my family was still asleep under quilts and the glow of a programmable tree, and I realized that revenge, if you wanted it to taste clean, had to be served without shouting, like a dish that arrives under a silver lid and fills the room with aroma long before anyone admits they are hungry. I wrapped the gifts I had already bought for my nieces and nephew, not out of duty, but because I refused to let the worst version of my family define the version of me that the children would remember. And I printed simple cards in my neat handwriting that said, "Wishing you warmth and courage this winter," a line that would mean nothing to the adults and everything to the kids who pay attention, then scheduled the delivery for the morning of Christmas Eve so the packages would arrive while I was high above the center of the country. I made one more choice that felt both petty and necessary, which was to mute the family group chat without leaving it, because departure would hand them a story about me being the one who broke ties, while silence would make them sit with their own words when the images began to appear, and I replaced the chat's notification banner with a clean white bar that looked like fresh snow, a little theater trick that helped me resist the reflex to look whenever the phone vibrated. I cooked pasta for dinner and ate it at the counter, aware of how peaceful the apartment became when I stopped rehearsing defenses to conversations that were never going to be fair. And then I opened my laptop again and drafted a short message to my mother that said, "I hope the gathering is everything you wanted and that the house feels calm and joyful," which read like a blessing and functioned like a mirror. And after sitting with it for a long minute, I pressed send, not because I wanted her to write back, but because I wanted a timestamp that would later make the record clear. When I finally turned out the lights and slid between the sheets, the room humming its small winter noises, I felt the kind of nervousness that belongs to beginnings rather than endings. The rapid beat under the ribs that tells you something has shifted in your favor even if the world has not yet noticed, and as I let my eyes close I pictured the first photo I would take in the airport, a composition of coffee cup, boarding pass, and the curved window that would catch the pale pink of morning. And I realized that the most satisfying part of this plan was not the reaction it would provoke, but the simple act of directing my own holiday like a film I had decided to produce. My phone vibrated once, then again, and without reaching for it I knew it was the family thread blooming with photos of the mantle and the cookie assembly line and the kids posing in matching pajamas, and I felt no stab, only a cool quiet. As if the distance had already turned into altitude, I let the phone face down on the nightstand while the screen pulsed, because the first note of my answer would not be words at all. It would be the dawn shot from seat by the wing, and I intended to make sure they saw it. The car arrived in the ink blue hour before dawn when even the loudest parts of the city choose to whisper. And I rode through streets salted to a dull glitter while the driver made the kind of small talk that feels like a blanket you do not need but accept because it is polite, then stepped into the airport with the resolve of someone who has already rehearsed the scene in her head, right down to the coffee cup angled beside the boarding pass and the window that would catch a thin ribbon of pink as the sun considered whether to show up for me, and I could feel, with the quiet thrill of a stage light warming, that this was not an escape so much as an entrance. At the gate I opened my notes and tightened the language on the first post the way I tighten straps on luggage, replacing sentimental phrases with cleaner lines, cutting anything that sounded like an argument, because the point was never to convince them. It was to document a reality where their approval did not determine whether my holiday counted, and when the plane lifted through cloud into that pale, rinsed light that makes adults look briefly like children, I took the photograph and saved it without caption, holding the moment like a match I was not ready to strike. Landing felt like stepping into a postcard someone had actually taken the trouble to laminate, because the air in the mountains has that glassy clarity that makes the outlines of everything, peaks, pines, the cut of a roof against the sky, seem almost exaggerated, and the shuttle wound up the road in a patient line while the driver narrated the week's snowfall and the best runs as if we were all already friends. I watched couples lean together over maps and a family negotiate who would take the first lesson, and I kept my face turned to the window, letting the landscape speak for me. The resort lobby smelled faintly of orange peel and cold stone warmed by fire, with a long cedar bar where a bartender polished glasses as if that were a sacred ritual. And the woman at the desk said my name with a tone that suggested everything had been prepared exactly as requested, which in its own small way was a balm for a person who had spent too many holidays being told that her needs could be accommodated only after children napped and in-laws had been consulted. In the room, sunlight reached across the floor like a cat staking territory, and the window framed a view of a lift swinging slowly over snow that looked untouched in the way good housekeeping never quite manages, and I set my suitcase on its side, hung the coat arranged gloves over the radiator, and allowed myself the luxury of stillness before deciding which version of myself to wear downstairs. The black turtleneck always makes my posture behave, and the lipstick the shade of cranberries has a way of telling strangers that I am not to be pitied, and by the time I took the elevator down to the bar, the nervous energy had turned into a steady hum. I ate a bowl of soup that tasted of roasted garlic and the kind of patience that cooks seldom possess in homes crowded with opinionated aunts, and I chatted with a woman from Seattle who had decided, after a divorce that sounded like a badly reviewed movie, that every year deserved at least one decision made solely for joy, and it felt oddly relieving to say out loud that I was here because my family announced that Christmas was for parents and couples, as if naming the wound lessened the sting and freed my hands to build something that resembled a splint. Afternoons slid into that blue hour when the lifts slow and the lights stitched along the walkways turn on one by one, and I took my first photo on the property with care, composing the shot so the fireplace, the glass of wine, and the slope beyond the window formed a quiet triangle, then posted it with a sentence I had sanded to a fine, almost careless finish, finding a tradition that fits when the old ones stop making room, and I toggled the audience so that family would see it and acquaintances would not be pulled into the undertow, because this was not about public vindication. This was about letting the right people sit with the right discomfort. The likes trickled in, polite friends and a colleague whose taste in mountain towns I trust. And I set the phone face down as the concierge talked me through morning runs and a private lesson with an instructor who apparently makes anxious adults feel like kids learning to balance for the first time, and I felt, beneath the civilized surface of the lobby, the low throb of satisfaction that comes when you make the story do what it refused to do for years. Because I had promised myself a small, precise act at the end of each step, I walked to the hotel gift boutique, selected a clean white postcard with a spare drawing of the range that looked like breath on glass, and wrote in my neatest hand the sentence my mother had used as a verdict, turned back upon itself until it read like a benediction I no longer needed from her, for parents and couples, for daughters and singles, for anyone who shows up. And I addressed it to my parents' house with a smile that felt sharper than kindness and kinder than fury, then handed it to the clerk with a request to mail it that evening so it would arrive exactly when the family began laying out their place settings for Christmas Eve. On my way back through the lobby, I let myself set one more clever snare, changing my Instagram bio to the line family of one still counts, and pinning the mountain photo so that it would greet anyone who clicked in looking for evidence that I was either thriving or failing. Because either way they would have to deal with the fact that I looked exactly like myself. When the phone started buzzing on the nightstand in the soft dark of the room, I knew without looking that the family chat had flared, and when the caller ID flashed my brother's name for the second time, and then, a beat later, my mother's, I let it ring through while snow fell past the window like confetti for an audience of one, and I lay very still, listening to the tone stop, reset, and begin again. Christmas Eve unfolded with the meticulous rhythm of a place designed to make strangers feel chosen, and I let the day carry me from a lesson where an instructor with kind eyes taught me how to trust the edges of my skis, to a late lunch by a window where the snow made handwriting of the wind across the slope, and while the dining room filled with families broadcasting their togetherness through clinking glasses and small corrections whispered between spouses, I reminded myself that my plan did not require me to pretend I wasn't occasionally lonely. It required me to refuse the story that loneliness meant I had nothing to offer. I took the photos I had promised myself I would take, one of the mountain with its long shadows falling like velvet ribbons, another of a mug leaving a clean circle on the table like a seal of arrival. And when I posted them I kept the captions spare and edged with humor, lines that could be read as travel banter by anyone who didn't know the backstory and as a gentle defiance by the people who had written me out of their script, and almost immediately the tremor began, because likes turned to comments, and comments became private messages. And the private messages included a cousin's hurried note that the family chat was confused, which we both understood as code for simmering. By dusk the messages had grown teeth, my brother presenting sarcasm as concern. Must be nice to spend on yourself when the rest of us are paying for kids' gifts. my sister-in-law dropping a line about priorities that pretended not to be a moral judgment. And finally, my mother's first missed call blooming on the lock screen like a peony you can smell from the next room. I watched the screen dim and brighten as the calls stacked up with the persistence of a habit, and I did not answer, not yet. Because ignoring the old choreography was part of the point. I ordered a seat at the small bar for dinner rather than a table, because bars carry an energy that belongs to arrivals and departures rather than to performances of belonging. And while I ate trout so delicate it felt like an apology for every overcooked fish I had endured at family gatherings, I opened the resort newsletter and read about their holiday toy drive and the table for one, table for all hour in the lounge a nightly invitation for solo travelers to share snacks and conversation under a sign that looked hand-drawn by someone who remembers what it is to show up and wonder where to stand. That was when the idea came together with the satisfying click of something mechanical finding its groove, because revenge, to my taste, should feed someone, not starve them. I asked the concierge whether the lounge would allow a hosted hour in someone's name, a quiet sponsorship that covered drinks and small plates for the solo guests who drifted in from the cold, and when she said the staff would be delighted. I wrote the names exactly as my parents liked to see them printed first and last, no nicknames, tidy serif font, and paid for the spread without bargaining, then handwrote a small card on the thick hotel stationery that said with gratitude from parents who believe holidays are for families of every shape, and when the concierge asked whether I wanted the hosts tagged on the resort's Instagram story, I smiled and shook my head. Because the beauty of the gesture was that the only people who would understand its edge were the ones who had handed me the blade. I went downstairs when the hour began and watched a loose constellation of people gather, 2 teachers on a break, a nurse who had traded shifts, a widower who told me the first 10 minutes in any new place are the hardest, and as they lifted their glasses under the placard with my parents' names, I felt a steadier warmth than any I had coaxed from the fireplace. A sense that I had taken the energy of exclusion and turned it into something that would not rot me from the inside. When I finally posted again, I kept it ruthlessly simple, a photograph of the placard in soft focus with the lounge lights making halos on the wood, and a caption that read some families set extra places at the table, and I added no tags and no location. Only the quiet implication that generosity had been chosen somewhere, somehow, and I set the audience so my family would definitely see it while acquaintances would not be pulled into the undertow. The reaction arrived with the speed of weather. My phone thrummed as if it were being shaken, the group thread igniting with demands for explanations wrapped as jokes, a cousin sending a daring "oh wow," and my mother calling again and again until even the screen's persistent glow began to look pleading, and still I let the calls roll into voicemail, because the message I wanted them to understand was not in anything I could say. It was in the fact that they were now watching an event they could not control. The resort reposted the lounge scene to their story with a generic heart and a thanks to our generous host, and within minutes another cousin wrote that mom had put on her coat and was walking around the house with the cordless phone. The one she uses when she wants to sound like she is moving and therefore must be believed. And that was the moment I realized the balance had shifted, not because I had hurt them, but because I had stopped negotiating for my seat. I took the elevator up to my room as the first flakes began to thicken outside, set the phone on the desk, and listened to the voicemails without pressing play, counting the notifications as if they were a metronome for a piece I had already learned, and then, because a promise is a promise, I set one more precise trap for the past. I scheduled a courier from the resort bakery to deliver, at first light, a box of gingerbread to my parents' door with a card that repeated their line back to them, in a tone so gentle it could have been mistaken for care, for parents, not singles, signed simply from the mountains, and I imagined the moment my mother would hold the note and feel the echo of her own words without an audience to applaud. When the phone rang again and the caller ID displayed my mother's cell followed by the home line and then, chillingly familiar, the old landline number I have not seen since they canceled it years ago, I felt the blood rise in my face as if a ghost had dialed. And I reached for the phone, not to answer, but to watch the digits insist on a version of the past that should not exist, while the final ring skated to silence and left me staring at the screen, wondering who, exactly, had just tried to reach me. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of silence that only mountain towns seem to know, a silence layered not with absence, but with weight, as if the air itself had thickened overnight and now pressed down gently on every roof, every tree branch, every human breath daring to disturb it, and I woke to find the snow stacked high against the balcony rails while my phone pulsed on the desk like a living thing I had abandoned. The notifications spilled one over another, missed calls, unread messages, voicemails queued in a list so long I had to scroll twice to see the bottom, and each one carried the same urgency, the same desperation disguised in different voices. A family that had written me out of their holiday now trying to claw me back into it, as if proximity to me could erase the ugliness of their choice. I made coffee from the room machine, sat on the edge of the bed with my hands wrapped around the small cup, and listened to one voicemail at random. My mother's voice, frayed and unsteady, saying she didn't know what had gotten into me, but that it was time to stop the nonsense and come home where I belonged, her words wobbling between command and plea until they collapsed under their own weight. I let the message end without replaying it because it told me more than she meant to reveal. They had not expected resistance, they had not expected silence, and they had not expected to be confronted with the mirror of their own exclusion. Another message, this one from my father, came through calmer, as if he believed authority would correct the imbalance, reminding me that family disagreements are private matters and that broadcasting my trip on social media was a betrayal of trust. Though he conveniently ignored the betrayal of telling me Christmas was for parents and couples only. I deleted his message without hesitation, not because I was unmoved, but because I had learned that authority built on dismissal only holds as much power as you are willing to grant it, and I was done paying that tax. The irony was not lost on me that the ski resort, which had no blood ties to me, had managed to make me feel more welcome in 48 hours than my own family had in years. From the bartender who remembered my name after one drink to the concierge who asked if my Christmas morning had begun peacefully. I walked to the lounge where the remnants of last night's hosted hour still lingered, napkins stacked neatly, a few empty glasses waiting for collection, the placard with my parents' names removed, but the memory of it still hanging in the air. And I realized that I had stumbled into a kind of belonging that did not require performance, a belonging created by shared circumstance rather than bloodline, and that maybe, just maybe, it was stronger because of it. When I finally posted the photograph I had saved for this morning, I did it with the same precision as before, selecting the one of me standing on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, mountains stretching sharp and infinite behind me, steam curling from the mug in my hands, and I wrote a caption that read, "Sometimes the best gift is realizing who never deserved a seat at your table," and I pressed share before I could second-guess the bite in it. The responses were immediate and varied. Friends cheered, colleagues sent quiet encouragement, and my cousins posted cryptic half-jokes in the family thread that told me my post had landed exactly where it needed to. My mother called again within minutes, and this time her voicemail cracked fully, her words spilling into sobs as she said she missed me, that it wasn't what I thought, that she wanted to talk face to face, and for a moment I felt the old reflex to cave. To imagine that forgiveness would repair what was broken. But then I remembered how quickly they had dismissed me when it cost them nothing, and how quickly they reached for me only when their pride was on the line, and the reflex quieted into something harder, sharper, and more honest. I spent the afternoon skiing runs that left my legs trembling, letting the cold carve lines into my cheeks until my face felt raw and alive, and when I returned to the room I found another message, this one more measured. My father again, saying that I was being unfair, that family fights happen but families stay together, and I read it twice before setting the phone down, because it struck me that he had slipped, that he had revealed the truth. They wanted me in the family only on their terms, only as the quiet daughter who accepted their hierarchy without complaint, and what unsettled them most was not my absence, but my refusal to play that role anymore. Evening came with the muffled sound of fireworks from the town below, bursts of color hidden behind snow clouds, and I stood at the window while my phone rang one last time. My mother's number flashing with the kind of insistence that feels like a hand gripping your wrist. I held it, watching the call vibrate against the wood of the desk, and I let my thumb hover over the green icon until the ringing cut to silence. I could have answered, could have offered a word that would smooth the jagged edges for a season, but I realized that forgiveness offered too quickly is only another form of submission, and that silence, in this moment, was not cruelty but clarity. When I finally lay down in bed, the mountains dark against a sky that had swallowed the last traces of color, I thought about the card I had mailed, the photos I had posted, the lounge I had filled with strangers who would remember kindness attached to my parents' names. And I knew that my revenge had been exacted not in shouting but in precision. Whether I ever chose to pick up the phone again was a question I could leave unanswered, because the truth was already there in the quiet. They had uninvited me, but I had refused to disappear. And sometimes the most permanent answer is the one you never speak aloud.